He poured boiling water on his 7 months pregnant wife. Not by accident, not in a moment of carelessness.
Look at her face.
He did it deliberately, coldly, looking her straight in the eyes while she begged him to stop. Dominic Russo, a mafia boss who commanded respect from every corner of New York City, who could have a man disappear with a single phone call, who ran an empire built on fear and loyalty. He burned her skin, scarred her body, tried to destroy her spirit, all to please his mistress. He thought that would be the end of her, that she would disappear into her pain and shame, that the threat of his power would keep her silent forever. But what Tasha did next, what she planned in the weeks that followed, didn't just destroy his life. It brought down his entire organization, stripped him of his empire, turned his own family against him, and left him in a federal prison cell with nothing but regret. And he never saw it coming. Hello, friends. Welcome to our story. Before we dive into this intense journey, I want to know, where in the world are you watching this from right now? Are you in New York City, maybe Toronto or Vancouver, London, Manchester, or Birmingham? Maybe you're watching from Sydney, Melbourne, or Auckland, or perhaps Miami, Atlanta, Houston, Los Angeles, or Chicago. Drop your city in the comments right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. And while you're down there, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support means everything. Now let's get into the story because trust me, you're not ready for what Tasha did to this man. 3 years ago, Tasha Williams was 26 years old, working as a senior marketing coordinator at a boutique advertising agency in Midtown Manhattan. She lived in a small but comfortable studio apartment in Astoria, Queens, took the N train to work every morning, and had her entire life mapped out with precision. She was going to make creative director by 30, save enough for a down payment on a condo by 32, and maybe, just maybe, find love when the timing was right. She wasn't looking for a man to complete her. She was already complete. She had her career, her independence, her dreams, and a circle of friends who had her back. Life was good. Life was hers. Then she met Dominic Russo at her cousin Monica's wedding reception at the Plaza Hotel. And Lord, that man didn't just make an entrance. He owned the entire room the moment he walked through those doors. Dominic stood 6'3" tall, wearing a custom-tailored charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than Tasha's monthly rent. But it wasn't the suit that made people stare. It was him, his presence, the way he carried himself like he knew secrets no one else did, like he held power in his hands and could crush or elevate you with a single decision. His black hair was perfectly styled, his jaw sharp enough to cut glass, and when he moved you could see the definition of muscle beneath that. Expensive fabric. He wasn't just fit, he was built, solid, dangerous, and the tattoos. Tasha could see them peeking out from his collar, dark ink creeping up the side of his neck, and when he moved his hands, those large scarred hands, she caught glimpses of more ink wrapping around his wrists, disappearing under his cuffs. There was something about those tattoos that made him look like he'd lived 10 lifetimes, like he'd seen things and done things that most people couldn't even imagine. He was talking business with a group of men near the bar, and the way they listened to him, the way they leaned in when he spoke, nodding with this mixture of respect and fear, it was magnetic, terrifying, intoxicating. Tasha's cousin Monica appeared at her elbow, grabbing her arm with both hands, her eyes wide with excitement and something else, something that looked almost like warning. "Girl, do you see that man over there?" Monica whispered, her voice urgent. "That's Dominic Russo. He's connected, Tasha. Like, connected. His family runs half of Brooklyn and parts of Manhattan. Real estate, construction, sanitation, nightclubs, all of it. Word is he's being groomed to take over the entire operation when his uncle steps down. That man is worth millions, probably tens of millions, and he's single." Tasha glanced at Dominic again, then back at Monica, skepticism written all over her face. "Connected? Monica, are you telling me I'm telling you he's powerful. Monica cut in, lowering her voice even more. His businesses are legitimate, mostly. But his family, they have history, you know? Old New York history, the kind people don't talk about openly. My husband's cousin used to work for his construction company, said Dominic's the smartest one in the family. Went to NYU, got his MBA, actually knows how to run businesses properly. He's trying to make everything legit, move the family into respectability. But still, he's dangerous, Tasha, in the best way possible. Tasha rolled her eyes, turning her attention back to the wedding reception, to the beautiful floral arrangements, and the string quartet playing something classical and romantic. Good for him. I'm not interested in dangerous men, Monica. I have a career to build. Child, you better reconsider, Monica said, squeezing her arm tighter. Men like that don't stay single for long. And besides, I already told him about you. He asked who you were. Tasha's heart did this stupid little flip that she immediately tried to ignore. You did what? I told him you were the smartest woman in our family, that you work in marketing, that you're single and focused on your career. He seemed very interested. Monica? Too late. He's coming over. And he was. Dominic Russo had detached himself from the group of men at the bar and was walking toward them with this easy, confident stride that made it look like he owned not just the room, but the entire hotel. Maybe the whole city. His eyes were locked on Tasha, dark and intense, and she felt her breath catch in her throat despite every logical part of her brain screaming at her to stay calm, to not be impressed, to remember that she didn't need a man, especially not a dangerous one with tattoos and connections and that kind of smile. Because when he smiled at her, when he stopped right in front of her and Monica, when he looked directly into her eyes and smiled, it was like the sun coming out after a storm. Warm, disarming, devastating. You must be Monica's cousin, he said, and his voice was deep, smooth with just the slightest hint of a Brooklyn accent underneath the polish. She told me you'd be here, said you're the smartest woman in the family. Tasha tried not to notice how good he smelled, like expensive cologne mixed with something else, something masculine and clean and entirely too appealing. Did she now? She did. He extended his hand, and Tasha noticed the tattoos on his knuckles, small, intricate designs that looked like they meant something specific, something important. I'm Dominic Russo. Tasha Williams. She shook his hand, and his grip was firm, warm, confident. The kind of handshake that told you everything about a person. He wasn't trying to prove anything. Wasn't squeezing too hard or being too gentle. Just solid. Sure. So Tasha Williams, Dominic said. And she noticed he didn't let go of her hand right away. Held it just a moment longer than necessary. What do you do when you're not being the most beautiful woman at wedding receptions? The line was smooth. Too smooth. But there was something about the way he said it. Like he actually meant it. That made her pulse quicken despite her best efforts to stay unaffected. I work in marketing, she said, gently pulling her hand back. Advertising agency in Midtown. Nothing as impressive as running half of Brooklyn, I'm sure. Dominic's smile widened, and she saw something flash in his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or appreciation. Smart and informed. I like that. Most people hear my last name, and either they're intimidated or they're suddenly my best friend, trying to get something from me. But you're different. You don't seem impressed at all. Should I be? No, he said, and his expression shifted, became more serious, more genuine. Actually, that's exactly why I want to know more about you. You see past the surface. That's rare. That's valuable, especially in my world. Monica had conveniently disappeared, leaving them alone near the edge of the dance floor, and Tasha found herself trapped in this conversation with Dominic Russo, this dangerous, attractive, entirely too charming man who was looking at her like she was the only person in the room. They talked for 3 hours that night. He asked her about her work, her goals, her dreams for the future. He asked about her family, where she grew up. Harlem, she told him, raised by her mother after her father died when she was 12. What she loved about New York, what she wanted out of life. And he listened, really listened, not like he was waiting for his turn to talk, but like he genuinely cared about her answers, like every word she said mattered. He told her about his businesses, the construction company that was currently rebuilding 3 blocks in Red Hook, the waste management contracts his family held throughout Brooklyn and Queens, the nightclub in Tribeca that was becoming the hottest spot in Manhattan. He talked about wanting to legitimize everything, about moving his family away from the shadows and into the light, about building something that his future children could be proud of without the weight of the past hanging over them. My grandfather, Dominic said at one point, his voice quieter, more reflective. He did what he had to do to survive. He came from Sicily with nothing, built an empire from the ground up in a city that didn't want Italians succeeding. I respect that. I honor that. But times have changed. The old ways don't work anymore. I want to build something different, something that lasts without the blood and the violence and the federal investigations. Tasha watched him as he talked, noticed the passion in his voice, the way his hands moved when he spoke about his vision for the future, and she found herself believing him, found herself drawn to this man who seemed so different from what she'd expected, so much more thoughtful and ambitious and real. By the end of the night, she'd given him her number. She went home to her studio apartment in Astoria, took off her heels, and sat on her bed thinking about Dominic Russo, about his smile, his voice, the way he'd looked at her, and the tiny voice in the back of her mind that sounded suspiciously like her mother's, whispering, "Be careful, baby. Men like that are dangerous for a reason." But Tasha pushed that voice aside because the danger, she told herself, was part of what made him interesting. And besides, he was trying to change, trying to be better, trying to build something legitimate. She wanted to believe that. She needed to believe that. The courtship was like something out of a movie, the kind of movie where the dangerous, powerful man falls for the independent woman and transforms into something softer, something better. Dominic sent flowers to her office the Monday after the wedding, 3 dozen white roses with a card that said simply, "Thinking about you. D." Her coworkers crowded around her desk, oohing and awing, asking who the mystery man was. Tasha just smiled and said it was someone she'd met at a wedding, trying to downplay it even though her heart was racing. He texted her that afternoon. "Dinner tonight? I know this Italian place in Little Italy, family owned, best food in the city." She should have said no. Should have told him she needed to take things slow, that she barely knew him, that jumping into dinner dates with Mafia-connected men wasn't exactly smart. But instead, she texted back. "What time?" The restaurant was small, intimate, tucked away on a side street in Little Italy, with checkered tablecloths and candles on every table. The owner greeted Dominic like family, hugged him, kissed both his cheeks, called him figlio mio, and ushered them to a corner table with a view of the street. The food was incredible. Homemade pasta, veal that melted in your mouth, wine that tasted like it cost more than Tasha's weekly grocery budget. And Dominic was attentive. He asked her questions, remembered details from their conversation at the wedding, made her laugh with stories about his childhood in Brooklyn, about his grandmother who ruled the family with an iron fist and a wooden spoon, about his younger sister who is currently in law school at Columbia and driving him crazy with worry. "You worry about your sister?" Tasha asked, smiling at the thought of this powerful, dangerous man fretting over a law student. "Every day," Dominic said, his expression softening. "She's smart, smarter than me probably, but she's also stubborn, wants to be a prosecutor. Can you imagine? A Russo becoming a prosecutor? Sounds like she wants to make her own path." "Sounds like she wants to give me a heart attack," Dominic said, but he was smiling, genuine affection in his eyes. "But I respect it. She's her own person. I'd never try to control her choices. That statement, I'd never try to control her choices, should have been a red flag. Should have made Tasha wonder why he felt the need to say it so explicitly. But in the moment, sitting across from him in that candlelit restaurant, watching him talk about his family with such love and respect, she just felt warm, safe, special. Over the next 3 months, Dominic became a constant presence in her life. He showed up at her office on random Wednesday afternoons with coffee and pastries from her favorite bakery. He sent her texts throughout the day, not the annoying, constant kind, but thoughtful messages that showed he was thinking about her. Hope your presentation went well, or saw this article about marketing trends and thought of you, with a link attached. He took her to Broadway shows, to art galleries in Chelsea, to jazz clubs in the West Village, where they'd sit close together in dark corners and listen to music that felt like it was being played just for them. He introduced her to his friends, successful men who owned restaurants and real estate companies and import businesses, and they were all respectful, charming, treating her like she mattered, like she was already part of Dominic's inner circle. He met her friends too, brought champagne to a dinner party at her friend Keisha's apartment in Bed-Stuy, charmed every single person there with stories and jokes and genuine interest in their lives. After he left, Keisha pulled Tasha aside, eyes wide. "Girl, where did you find him? He's fine. He's rich. And he actually seems to respect you. Don't mess this up." But there were moments, small moments that Tasha noticed but didn't fully register at the time, where something felt off. Like when they were at dinner one night and Tasha's phone buzzed with a text from her male coworker Jason asking about a project deadline. Dominic glanced at her phone screen, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "Who's Jason?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "Just a coworker," Tasha said, texting back quickly. "We're working on a campaign together." "You work with him a lot?" "Sometimes." "Why?" Dominic shrugged, that easy smile sliding back into place. "Just curious. You never mentioned him before." It seemed innocent enough, seemed like normal boyfriend curiosity, but something about the way he'd asked, the edge underneath the casual tone, made Tasha's instincts whisper a warning she chose to ignore. Or the time they were supposed to meet for dinner, and Tasha got caught up at work, arriving at the restaurant 45 minutes late. Dominic was waiting at the bar, and when she rushed up to him, apologizing profusely, he turned to her, with this cold expression she'd never seen before. "I don't like being kept waiting, Tasha. I'm so sorry. The client meeting ran long and I couldn't just leave." "You could have called." "I did call. I texted you 3 times and called once. Didn't you get them?" Dominic pulled out his phone, looked at it, and his expression shifted, softened, like someone had flipped a switch. "Oh, you're right. I'm sorry, baby. My phone was on silent. I shouldn't have snapped at you." He kissed her forehead, pulled her close, ordered her favorite wine. "Forgive me?" And she did. Because he apologized. Because he seemed genuine. Because everyone has bad days, right? Everyone gets irritated when plans change. These moments happened more frequently as the relationship progressed, but they were always followed by apologies, by gifts, by Dominic being extra attentive and loving, and Tasha found herself making excuses for behavior that, if she was honest with herself, reminded her of stories she'd heard, articles she'd read about controlling men. But Dominic wasn't controlling. He was protective. There was a difference, she told herself. 6 months after they met, Dominic proposed. He rented out the entire top floor of a boutique hotel in Brooklyn Heights, the one with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Manhattan skyline and the Brooklyn Bridge lit up like something from a dream. He filled the space with white roses and candles, hundreds of them, creating this ethereal glow that made everything feel magical, otherworldly. When Tasha walked in, Dominic had told her they were going to a business dinner, so she was completely unsuspecting. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Dominic stood in the center of the room, wearing a tailored black suit, and in his hands was a small velvet box. He smiled at her, that devastating smile that still made her heart race, and got down on one knee. "Tasha Williams," he said, his voice thick with emotion, his dark eyes locked on hers. "You are everything I've been looking for my entire life. You're intelligent, you're beautiful, you're strong, and you see me for who I really am. Not the name, not the reputation, not the business. Just me. I want to build a life with you. I want to build an empire with you. I want to wake up next to you every morning for the rest of my life and know that I'm the luckiest man in New York. Will you marry me?" The ring was stunning. A 3-carat cushion-cut diamond, set in platinum, surrounded by smaller diamonds that caught the candlelight like tiny stars. It was the kind of ring that probably cost more than Tasha made in a year, the kind of ring that women dreamed about. Tasha looked at Dominic, at this powerful, dangerous, complicated man who had swept into her life and made her feel things she'd never felt before. And she thought about her mother's warnings, about the small red flags she'd noticed, about the voice in her head that said, "Be careful." But she also thought about how he made her laugh, how he listened to her, how he supported her career and her dreams, how he'd introduced her to his family and made her feel like she belonged. She thought about the future he was offering, security, love, a partnership. She said yes. Of course she said yes. How could she not? The engagement party was held at Dominic's family estate in Alpine, New Jersey, a massive property with a main house that looked like something from a mansion tour, surrounded by manicured gardens and a guest house bigger than most people's actual homes. His entire family was there. His uncle Vincent, the current head of the family, a man in his 70s with sharp eyes and a presence that commanded respect. His younger sister, Isabella, who hugged Tasha warmly and whispered, "Welcome to the family. You're going to need allies." Cousins and associates, and people whose exact relationship to the Russos was never quite explained, but who all treated Dominic with deference. Everyone was drinking champagne, eating from tables loaded with expensive Italian food catered by the best restaurants in the city, celebrating the engagement. But Tasha noticed something. She noticed the way people spoke to Dominic. Not like he was the groom-to-be, but like he was already the boss. She noticed the way men would pull him aside for whispered conversations, the way they'd hand him envelopes or nod seriously at whatever he said. She noticed the weight of it all, the reality of what she was marrying into, and for a moment, just a brief, terrifying moment, she wanted to run. But then Dominic found her on the terrace, away from the crowd, and wrapped his arms around her from behind, pressing a kiss to her temple. "You okay?" he murmured. "I know my family can be overwhelming." "I'm fine," Tasha said, leaning back against his solid chest. "Just taking it all in. They love you already. My uncle said you're the best thing that's ever happened to me, and he's right." Tasha smiled, letting herself relax into his embrace, letting herself believe that everything was going to be okay. But then she saw her mother. Sandra Williams had arrived late to the party. She'd driven up from Harlem, uncomfortable with the wealth and opulence of the Russo estate, and now she was standing near the entrance to the main house, looking around with barely concealed concern. When her eyes found Tasha, she waved her over with a gesture that brooked no argument. "Mom, what's wrong?" Tasha asked when she reached her mother, glancing back at Dominic, who was now in conversation with 3 men in expensive suits. Sandra grabbed Tasha's arm and pulled her into a quiet hallway inside the house, away from the music and laughter and clinking champagne glasses. "Baby," Sandra said, her voice low and urgent, her fingers tight on Tasha's arm. "I need you to listen to me. Really listen." "Mama, what is it? This is supposed to be a happy day." "That's exactly why I need to talk to you now, before it's too late." Sandra's eyes searched Tasha's face, desperate, pleading. "Something about that man doesn't sit right with my spirit. He's too smooth, Tasha. Too perfect. Everything about him is too controlled, too calculated. Men like that are always hiding something. Tasha pulled away, frustration building in her chest. Mama, you're being paranoid. Dominic loves me. He treats me well. He's successful and ambitious and wants to build a future with me. What more do you want? I want you to be safe, Sandra said, her voice cracking. I want you to think about what you're getting into. This family, these people, they're not like us, baby. This isn't just wealth. This is something else, something dangerous. Dominic is leaving that world behind, Tasha said, hearing the defensiveness in her own voice. He's making everything legitimate. He's trying to be better. Men don't leave that world, Tasha. That world is in their blood. It's who they are. And once you marry him, you'll be trapped. You'll belong to him and to that family, and if things go wrong, if he shows you who he really is, you won't be able to just walk away. These people don't let you walk away. You don't even know him, Mama. You've barely spoken to him. I know enough, Sandra said, tears forming in her eyes now. I know I raised you to be smart, to be independent, to never let any man control you. And I'm watching you walk straight into a trap, and there's nothing I can do to stop you because you're already in love with him. The words hit Tasha like a slap, not because they were mean, but because they were true. She was in love with Dominic, completely, totally in love with him. And that love had made her blind to things she should have been paying attention to, had made her rationalize behavior that should have sent her running, had made her ignore her own instincts because she wanted this fairy tale to be real. But she wasn't ready to admit that, not to her mother, not to herself. I'm an adult, Mama, Tasha said quietly. I'm making my own choices, and I choose Dominic. I choose this life. If you can't support that, then maybe you shouldn't have come. Sandra's face crumpled, and for a moment Tasha thought her mother might actually cry. But Sandra just nodded slowly, wiping at her eyes. I'll always support you, baby, she said softly. Even when I think you're making a mistake, even when you don't want to hear the truth, I'll be here. And when you need me, if you need me, I'll be waiting. Are you still with me? This story is about to get so much darker, and I need to know you're ready for it. If you're feeling this story so far, drop it in the comments right now. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do it. We have so many more powerful stories coming your way. Trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next because Tasha's about to walk straight into a nightmare, and the man she loves is going to become someone she doesn't recognize. The wedding was held 4 months later at the Pierre Hotel in Manhattan, a lavish affair with 300 guests, a 10-piece orchestra, and enough flowers to stock an entire florist shop for a month. Tasha wore a custom Vera Wang gown that made her look like she'd stepped out of a bridal magazine, and Dominic wore a Tom Ford tuxedo with his tattoos carefully concealed beneath long sleeves and a high collar. They looked perfect together, like a power couple from a movie or a television show, beautiful, successful, in love. But during the reception, Tasha caught something that made her stomach twist with unease. She was talking with her bridesmaids near the bar when she saw Dominic across the ballroom, standing with a woman she'd never seen before. The woman was stunning, tall, with long, dark hair and the kind of face that belonged on magazine covers. She wore a red dress that hugged her curves, and she was standing too close to Dominic, her hand on his arm. Her head tilted up toward him as she spoke, and Dominic was smiling at her. Not his public smile, the charming, polite one he used for business associates and distant family members. This was something else, something more intimate. Tasha excused herself from her friends and crossed the ballroom, her heart pounding with something that felt like jealousy mixed with fear. When she reached Dominic's side, she slipped her hand into his, claiming him, and the woman in red stepped back slightly, her expression shifting from intimate to neutral in a heartbeat. Baby, there you are, Dominic said, turning to Tasha with that smile she loved. But something in his eyes was different, guarded maybe, or annoyed at the interruption. This is Isabella Vasquez. She's the daughter of an old family friend. I've known her since we were kids." "Congratulations on your marriage," Isabella said, her voice smooth as silk, her eyes assessing Tasha like she was measuring competition. "Dominic's told me so much about you." "Funny," Tasha said, keeping her voice light even though something inside her was screaming. "He's never mentioned you." Isabella's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Well, we go way back, don't we, Dom?" Dom. She called him Dom. Tasha had never once heard anyone call him that. Not his family, not his friends. It was too personal, too familiar. "Bella and I grew up in the same neighborhood," Dominic said, and his hand tightened on Tasha's. "Her father worked with my uncle. That's all." "That's all," Isabella echoed, but there was something in the way she said it that made Tasha's skin crawl. "Enjoy your wedding night, you two. I'm sure it'll be unforgettable." She walked away, disappearing into the crowd, and Tasha turned to Dominic, questions building in her throat. "Who is she really?" Tasha asked. "I told you. An old friend." "She doesn't act like just a friend, Dominic." His expression hardened, and for just a second, just a flash, Tasha saw something cold in his eyes. Something that reminded her of the warning her mother had given, of the reputation the Russo family carried, of the darkness underneath all the charm and romance. "Are we really going to do this on our wedding night?" Dominic asked, his voice low, controlled. "Are we going to start our marriage with jealousy and accusations?" "I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm just asking." And I answered, "She's an old friend, that's it. Now can we please enjoy our wedding? Please, Tasha." He softened his voice on that last part, brought her hand to his lips, and kissed her knuckles gently, and Tasha felt her resolve crumbling. Because he was right. This was their wedding night. This was supposed to be the happiest day of their lives. She didn't want to ruin it with suspicion and questions. So she let it go. She smiled, nodded, let him pull her onto the dance floor for their first dance as husband and wife. And as they swayed together to Frank Sinatra's "The Way You Look Tonight," surrounded by 300 witnesses to their love, Tasha pushed aside the unease, the warnings, the tiny voice in her head that said, "You should have listened to your mother." The first year of marriage was a slow, subtle slide into control. It started small. Little comments here and there that seemed like concern but felt like criticism. "That dress is a little tight, don't you think? You don't want people getting the wrong idea about you. Why do you need to go out with your friends so often? Don't you want to spend time with your husband? I don't like the way your coworker Jason looks at you. Maybe you should request a different project team." Then it escalated. Dominic wanted to know where she was going, who she was with, when she'd be home. He'd call her 5-6 times a day, not to chat, but to check in, to make sure she was where she said she'd be. If she didn't answer immediately, he'd get angry, accusing her of ignoring him, of not prioritizing their marriage. "I'm your husband," he'd say, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "The least you can do is answer when I call." He didn't like her working late, didn't like her going to after-work drinks with colleagues, didn't like the idea of her being around other men without him present. So slowly, carefully, he started suggesting she might be happier working from home, doing freelance consulting instead of working at the agency. "You're so talented, baby," he'd say, his hands on her shoulders, his voice smooth and persuasive. "You could make your own hours, work with clients you actually care about, and you'd be home more. We'd see each other more. Isn't that what you want?" And Tasha, who'd spent the first year of marriage trying to keep the peace, trying to be the perfect wife, trying to prove to herself that her mother had been wrong about Dominic, she said yes. She quit her job at the agency, started doing freelance work from their penthouse apartment in Tribeca, and slowly, without fully realizing it was happening, she became isolated. Her friends stopped calling as much because she'd canceled plans too many times. Her coworkers moved on, building careers and connections while she worked alone in an apartment that felt more like a gilded cage with every passing month. Her mother called weekly, asking how she was doing, and Tasha would lie. would say everything was fine, because admitting the truth, that she'd made a terrible mistake, that her mother had been right all along, was too painful, too humiliating. And then Tasha got pregnant. She found out on a random Tuesday morning in March, staring at the positive pregnancy test in the bathroom of their penthouse, her hands shaking with a mixture of joy and fear. She was excited. She wanted children, had always wanted to be a mother. But something about the timing felt wrong. Something about bringing a baby into this marriage, this life, this increasingly suffocating dynamic with Dominic, made her stomach twist with anxiety. But when she told Dominic that evening, he was thrilled. Genuinely, beautifully thrilled. He picked her up, spun her around, kissed her like he used to when they first started dating. And for a moment, just one perfect moment, Tasha thought maybe this would fix things. Maybe a baby would bring them back together, would remind Dominic of why he'd fallen in love with her, would soften all the hard edges their marriage had developed. For the first few months, it seemed like her hope was justified. Dominic was attentive, caring. He went to doctor's appointments with her, bought her prenatal vitamins and pregnancy books, rubbed her feet when they swelled. He was the version of himself she'd fallen in love with. The charming, thoughtful, loving man who made her feel like the center of his universe. But then, when Tasha was 5 months pregnant, she saw the text message. She wasn't snooping. She wasn't trying to invade his privacy. Dominic's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter while he was in the shower, and Tasha glanced at it reflexively, the way you do when a phone makes noise near you. The preview on the screen said, Isabella V. I miss you. When can I see you again? Tonight? Tasha's blood turned to ice. Isabella, the woman from the wedding, the one who'd called him Dom and looked at him like she owned him. Her hands were shaking as she picked up the phone, unlocked it with the passcode she knew, his birthday. Too easy, she'd thought, when he gave it to her, but hadn't questioned it, and opened the message thread. What she saw made her stomach drop. Months of messages, going back to before the wedding. Isabella sending him photos, not explicit, but intimate. Her in a dress, asking his opinion. Her at a restaurant, saying she wished he was there. Messages about meeting up, about dinners, about being careful, about not getting caught. And Dominic's responses, equally intimate, equally damning. You looked beautiful last night. I'll see you Tuesday. Same place. We need to be more careful. Tasha's getting suspicious. Tasha felt like she was going to be sick. She scrolled further back, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears, and found messages from their wedding day, from hours after they'd exchanged vows. Dominic texting Isabella. Wish you were here instead. Her husband, the man she'd married, the father of her unborn child. He'd been having an affair, probably from the beginning. Maybe the entire relationship had been a lie. The bathroom door opened, steam billowing out, and Dominic walked into the kitchen wearing just a towel, his muscular frame covered in water droplets, his tattoos on full display. He saw Tasha holding his phone, saw the look on her face, and his expression shifted, from relaxed to alert to angry in the span of 3 seconds. What are you doing? He asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Who is she? Tasha asked, her voice breaking. Who is she really, Dominic? Give me my phone. Answer me. I said. Dominic crossed the distance between them in 3 quick strides, grabbed the phone from her hand with more force than necessary. Give me my phone. Tasha stepped back, her hand instinctively moving to her stomach, to the life growing inside her. You're cheating on me, with Isabella. You've been cheating on me the entire time, haven't you? Even before we got married. Dominic stared at her, and for a long moment, he didn't deny it. Didn't try to lie or gaslight her or make excuses. He just looked at her with this cold, calculating expression, like he was deciding how to handle the situation, what story to tell, what manipulation would work best. Then he shrugged. Actually shrugged. So what if I am? He said. What are you going to do about it, Tasha? You're pregnant with my child. You're completely dependent on me financially. You have no job, no income, no independence. You think you can just leave? You think you have options? You don't." The words hit her like physical blows because they were true. She'd let him isolate her, let him talk her into quitting her job, let him take control of every aspect of their life. She had access to their joint account, yes, but Dominic controlled the money. She lived in his apartment, drove his car, existed entirely within the world he'd built around her. She was trapped. "I could tell your family," Tasha said, her voice small, trying to find some leverage, some power. "Your Uncle Vincent wouldn't approve of this. You're dishonoring the family." Dominic laughed, actually laughed, and the sound was cruel. "You think my uncle doesn't know? You think powerful men don't have mistresses? That's how our world works, baby. Wives for show, for heirs, for respectability. Mistresses for pleasure. Isabella's father is one of Vincent's oldest associates. This arrangement is practically blessed." Tasha felt tears streaming down her face, felt her whole world crumbling around her, felt every warning her mother had ever given her come crashing down like prophecy fulfilled. "I hate you," she whispered. "No, you don't," Dominic said, his voice softening, becoming almost gentle, and that shift was somehow more terrifying than the cruelty. "You love me. You'll always love me. And you'll stay because you have nowhere else to go. Because you're smart enough to know that leaving me would be the most dangerous decision you could ever make." The threat was implicit but clear. Women didn't leave the Russo family, not safely, not without consequences. The months that followed were the darkest of Tasha's life. She stopped crying after the first week because tears didn't change anything, didn't fix anything, didn't give her any power in a situation where she had none. She just existed, moving through her days like a ghost in her own life, her belly growing larger with each passing week, her spirit shrinking smaller. Dominic continued the affair openly now. He didn't bother hiding it anymore. He'd leave the apartment for hours, sometimes entire evenings, and return smelling like perfume that wasn't Tasha's, his clothes wrinkled, his explanations dismissive. "I had business," he'd say, or "I was with the guys," or sometimes just, "Don't question me, Tasha." And she stopped questioning because what was the point? He'd already shown her exactly who he was, exactly how little she mattered to him, beyond being the incubator for his heir, beyond being the respectable wife who made him look good to the outside world. Isabella started calling the house phone. At first it seemed like wrong numbers. Tasha would answer and hear breathing on the other end, then a click. But after the third or fourth time, Isabella spoke. "Put Dom on the phone," she'd say, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "He's not here," Tasha would respond, her hand gripping the phone so tight her knuckles turned white. "Tell him I called. Tell him I'm waiting for him. Tell him not to keep me waiting too long, or I might have to come over there and remind him who he really belongs to." The psychological warfare was constant, calculated, designed to break Tasha down even further. And it was working. She was 7 months pregnant, completely isolated, financially dependent, legally bound to a man who treated her like property, and being harassed by his mistress, who seemed to take actual pleasure in Tasha's suffering. One night in late October, when the leaves were falling from the trees in their fiery autumn colors, and the air had that sharp chill that promised winter was coming, Tasha made a decision. She was going to leave. She didn't know how. Didn't know where she'd go or how she'd support herself and a baby, but she couldn't stay. She couldn't raise her child in this house, in this marriage, in this life where love was a weapon and control was the only currency that mattered. She started small, started researching domestic violence resources on her phone when Dominic was out, using incognito mode so he wouldn't see the browser history. Started reaching out to her mother again, having longer conversations, hinting that things weren't as perfect as she'd pretended. started looking at her bank statements, trying to understand the finances, trying to figure out if there was any money she could access without Dominic knowing. And then, on a Friday night, when Tasha was exactly 7 months and 2 weeks pregnant, everything exploded. Dominic came home at 11 p.m., late even for him, and Tasha was sitting on the couch in the living room, her laptop open, looking at apartment listings in neighborhoods she could potentially afford if she could somehow access money from their joint account. She didn't hear him come in, didn't realize he was standing behind the couch until she felt his hand on her shoulder, his grip tight, painful. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice deceptively calm. Tasha slammed the laptop shut, her heart racing. "Nothing, just browsing." "Let me see." "It's nothing, Dominic. I was just..." He reached over the couch, grabbed the laptop from her hands, opened it, and stared at the screen. Tasha watched his face change, watched anger flash across his features, watched his jaw clench, watched his eyes go cold and hard. "You're looking at apartments," he said slowly. "You're planning to leave me." "I just wanted to see what was out there. I wasn't actually..." "Don't lie to me." His voice exploded louder than she'd ever heard it, and Tasha flinched, her hands moving instinctively to protect her belly. "You're trying to leave. You think you can just walk away from me, from this family, from everything I've given you?" "You've given me nothing but pain," Tasha said, and something in her, something buried deep, something she thought he'd destroyed, suddenly surged to the surface. Anger. Real, hot, righteous anger. "You've isolated me. You've cheated on me. You've disrespected me. You treat me like I'm your property, like I exist only to serve you. I don't owe you anything, Dominic. This marriage is over." She stood up from the couch, her pregnant belly making the movement awkward, and tried to walk up past him toward the bedroom. She'd pack a bag, she decided. She'd call her mother. She'd leave tonight. Consequences be damned. But Dominic grabbed her arm, spun her around, and the look in his eyes was something beyond anger. It was rage. Pure, cold, calculated rage. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice low, threatening. "You belong to me. That baby belongs to me, and you're going to remember that." He dragged her, actually physically dragged her, his fingers digging into her arm hard enough to bruise, across the living room toward the kitchen. Tasha tried to pull away, tried to scream, but his grip was iron and fear had stolen her voice. "Dominic, stop. You're hurting me." He wasn't listening. He pulled her into the kitchen, and Tasha saw it then, the kettle on the stove, still steaming from where he'd apparently been making tea before he'd found her on the laptop. And she knew. In that moment, she knew exactly what he was going to do. "Please," she whispered, tears streaming down her face now, her hands clutching her belly, trying to protect her unborn child, even though she knew it was too late. "Please don't. Think about the baby. Think about our baby." "This baby," Dominic said, his voice cold as ice, "is the only reason you're still here. But you need to be taught a lesson, Tasha. You need to understand that there are consequences for disrespect, for trying to leave." He grabbed the kettle, and Tasha watched, frozen in horror, as her husband, the man she'd loved, the man she'd married, the father of her child, deliberately, methodically, poured boiling water down her arm. The pain was immediate, blinding, all-consuming. Tasha screamed, a sound she didn't recognize as coming from her own throat, and collapsed to the kitchen floor, cradling her burned arm against her chest. The smell of her own burning flesh filled her nostrils, and she thought she might pass out from the agony. But she didn't pass out. She stayed conscious through all of it, stayed conscious as Dominic stood over her, the empty kettle still in his hand, his expression completely emotionless. "Let that be a reminder," he said quietly, "of what happens when you try to defy me." Then he stepped over her body, walked out of the kitchen, and left the apartment. Just left her there, burned, pregnant, sobbing on the cold tile floor. Tasha doesn't remember how long she lay there. Could have been minutes. Could have been an hour. Time had ceased to have meaning in the face of that kind of pain, that kind of betrayal, that kind of absolute destruction of everything she'd thought her life was going to be. Eventually, she managed to crawl to the bathroom, running cold water over her arm, whimpering with each movement. The burn was severe, 2nd degree definitely, possibly worse in some spots. Where the water had pooled, the skin was already blistering, angry red and white, a permanent scar that would mark this moment on her body forever. She should go to the hospital, she knew, should call 911, should report what Dominic had done. But she was terrified. Terrified of what he'd do if she involved the police. Terrified of his family's connections, their power, their ability to make problems disappear. Terrified that if she went to a hospital, if she told the truth about what had happened, she'd end up as another statistic, another woman who fell, another mysterious accident. So instead, she treated the burn as best she could, with supplies from the medicine cabinet, wrapped it in gauze, and sat on the bathroom floor until the sun came up, her hand on her belly, feeling her baby move inside her, and made a promise. She would survive this. She would get out, and she would make him pay. I need to pause for just a moment because this story is devastating, and I know some of you might be going through something similar. If you are, please know that you're not alone. There are resources available. There are people who can help. You don't have to stay in a situation where you're being hurt. But right now, we're going to see how Tasha found her strength, how she fought back, and how she became the architect of the most perfect revenge I've ever seen. If you're feeling this story, drop a comment. Tell me what you're thinking. And please, subscribe to this channel because stories like this need to be told. Tasha spent the next 3 weeks planning. Not openly, not obviously. She became the perfect, submissive wife that Dominic wanted her to be. She stopped questioning him, stopped looking at apartments, stopped doing anything that might trigger another violent outburst. She cooked his favorite meals, smiled when he came home, pretended that everything was fine, and while she played the role of broken, obedient wife, she was gathering evidence. She photographed her burn. Every stage of healing, from the initial blistering to the scabbing to the permanent scarring. She saved the photos in a cloud account Dominic didn't know existed, created with a new email address on her phone when he was asleep. She started recording conversations. Her phone had a voice memo app that she activated discreetly whenever Dominic said something incriminating, whenever he threatened her, whenever he admitted to his affair with Isabella. She recorded him bragging to his associates about keeping his wife in line, recorded him laughing about how Tasha learned her lesson, recorded every piece of evidence she could gather about his abuse, his infidelity, his true character. She documented everything, every bruise, every threat, every instance where he controlled her money, her movements, her life, and she started researching Dominic's business dealings. This was the most dangerous part. Tasha had to be incredibly careful, had to cover her tracks perfectly, because if Dominic discovered what she was doing, she knew he wouldn't stop at boiling water next time. She went through his home office when he was out, photographed documents, bank statements showing offshore accounts, communications with business partners that referenced cash payments and under-the-table deals, emails discussing construction projects that involved bribing city officials. Everything she could find that proved Dominic's businesses weren't as legitimate as he claimed. The Italian-American Civil Rights League wouldn't protect him from actual crimes. The FBI and the IRS, though, they'd be very interested in what Tasha was finding. She also reached out to someone she never thought she'd contact, a prosecutor named Michael Chen, who'd given a talk at a women's advocacy event Tasha had attended years ago, before she'd met Dominic. She'd kept his card, buried in an old person she hadn't touched in 2 years. She called him from a burner phone she bought with cash at a bodega 3 blocks from the apartment. "Mr. Chen," she said when he answered, her voice shaking despite her efforts to sound calm. "My name is Tasha Russo. You don't know me, but I have information about the Russo crime family, and I need to speak with you in person. Safely. Soon." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then, "Mrs. Russo, I know exactly who you are. Where are you right now? Are you safe?" "Not on the phone," Tasha said. "Can you meet me somewhere public?" They met at a coffee shop in the financial district during lunch rush, public enough that no one would notice them, busy enough that their conversation would be lost in the noise. Tasha wore sunglasses and a hat, trying to be inconspicuous, her heart pounding with fear that one of Dominic's associates might see her, might report back to him. Michael Chen was in his 40s, wearing a suit and an expression of barely contained excitement when he saw the file folder Tasha placed on the table between them. "This is everything I have," Tasha said quietly. "Financial documents, recorded conversations, evidence of assault, evidence of criminal activity. I need protection. I need to know that when I leave him, when this goes public, he can't hurt me or my baby." Michael opened the folder, his eyes scanning the contents, and Tasha saw his expression shift from interest to absolute focus. This was more than he'd hoped for. This was years of investigation handed to him on a silver platter. "Mrs. Russo," he said carefully, "what you're describing is witness protection. Federal protection. That's a big step. You'd have to testify. You'd have to be willing to stand in court and tell everything. Are you prepared for that?" "I'm prepared to do whatever it takes to get away from him and to make sure he can't hurt anyone else the way he hurt me." Michael nodded slowly, already pulling out his phone to make calls. "Give me 72 hours. I need to coordinate with the FBI, get approval for protection, set up a safe location. Can you hold on for 3 more days?" "I've held on this long," Tasha said. 3 more days won't kill me." But she was wrong about that, because 2 days later, Isabella showed up at the apartment. Tasha was alone. Dominic at one of his business meetings that Tasha knew was just code for seeing his mistress. She was in the kitchen, making herself tea, carefully, always so carefully around boiling water now, when the doorbell rang. She looked through the peephole and saw Isabella standing there, wearing a designer coat and that same smug expression she'd worn at the wedding. Tasha's first instinct was to not answer, to pretend she wasn't home. But something in her, that spark of strength she'd been carefully nurturing over the past few weeks, made her open the door. "What do you want?" Tasha asked, not inviting Isabella in. Isabella smiled, and it was the smile of a predator who'd cornered her prey. "I want you to know something, Tasha. Dom is mine. He's always been mine. This marriage, this baby, it's all just for show. The real relationship, that's between him and me. And the sooner you accept that, the easier your life will be." Tasha stared at this woman who'd helped destroy her marriage, who'd participated in her humiliation, who stood there now with such arrogance and entitlement, and something inside her snapped. Not in a violent way, not in an uncontrolled way, but in a way that was cold, calculated, final. "You know what, Isabella?" Tasha said, her voice deadly calm. "You can have him. You can have all of him. The infidelity, the violence, the lies, the criminal enterprise that's about to come crashing down around both your heads. You want Dominic Russo? He's yours. But when the FBI comes knocking, and they will, don't say I didn't warn you." Isabella's smile faltered. "What are you talking about?" "You'll find out soon enough." Tasha stepped back and closed the door in Isabella's face, her heart racing, but her mind clear. She had 1 day left until her meeting with Michael Chen to finalize protection. 1 day until she could leave this apartment, this life, this nightmare, permanently. She could survive 1 more day. That night, Dominic came home drunk, which was unusual for him. He was always so controlled, so careful about his image. But tonight he stumbled through the door at 2 a.m., reeking of whiskey and perfume, and found Tasha sitting on the couch waiting for him. "Where were you?" she asked, not because she cared, but because she wanted him to incriminate himself one more time. Her phone was recording in her pocket. "With Isabella," he said, collapsing onto the couch beside her. "She's upset. Says you threatened her today." "I didn't threaten anyone. I just told her the truth." Dominic turned to look at her, his eyes bloodshot, his expression dangerous. "And what truth is that?" "That this is all about to end. Your empire, your reputation, all of it." For a moment, Dominic just stared at her. Then he started laughing, that same cruel laugh she'd heard when he'd discovered her looking at apartments, when he'd realized she wanted to leave. "You think you can destroy me?" he said, his voice full of drunken confidence. "You think you have that kind of power? You're nothing, Tasha. Without me, you're nothing. Just another single mother struggling to survive, and good luck finding anyone who'll want damaged goods." "I'm not damaged," Tasha said quietly. "I'm scarred. There's a difference. Scars mean you survived. Scars mean you're stronger than whatever tried to break you." "Philosophy won't save you," Dominic said, standing up unsteadily. "Nothing will save you. You're mine. Forever. And the sooner you accept that—" His phone buzzed. Dominic pulled it out, looked at the screen, and his face went white. "What?" Tasha asked, genuine curiosity overcoming her fear for a moment. Dominic didn't answer. He just stared at his phone, then at Tasha, then back at his phone. Then he turned and ran, actually ran out of the apartment, leaving Tasha alone in the sudden silence. She found out why the next morning. The FBI had arrested 17 members of the Russo crime family, including Dominic's uncle Vincent, in coordinated raids across New York and New Jersey. The news was on every channel. Major Mafia bust, Russo crime family crumbles, FBI seizes millions in assets. And in every article, every news report, there was mention of a confidential informant who'd provided crucial evidence. Tasha watched the news from a hotel room in Queens. Michael Chen had moved her the night before, right after Dominic had fled the apartment, right after the arrests had begun. She was safe, protected, finally truly safe for the first time in years. Her phone rang. Michael Chen. "The arrests went perfectly," he said, his voice full of satisfaction. "Dominic's been trying to call his lawyers all night, but they're not taking his calls. He's toxic now, untouchable, and we have enough evidence to put him away for 20 years, maybe more with the assault charges." "When do I testify?" Tasha asked. "Next month. Grand jury first, then trial if he doesn't take a plea deal. But Tasha, you need to prepare yourself. This is going to be public. Everyone's going to know what he did to you, what you did to bring him down. Your life is going to change." "It already has," Tasha said, looking down at her scarred arm, at her pregnant belly. "I'm ready." Wait until you see what happens next. This is where everything Tasha planned, everything she endured, everything she sacrificed, finally pays off. And I promise you, the justice she gets is so satisfying. If you're still with me, comment "justice" right now. Let me know you're here for the ending. The trial happened 3 months after Tasha gave birth to her daughter, whom she named Hope, because that's what had kept her alive, kept her fighting, kept her planning her escape even in the darkest moments. Hope that things could be better. Hope that justice existed. Hope that she could build a new life from the ashes of the old one. Dominic had been denied bail. Too much of a flight risk, the judge said, with his family's international connections and offshore accounts. So he sat in a federal holding facility while his empire crumbled around him. His businesses were seized under RICO statutes. His assets were frozen. His associates flipped on him one by one, cutting deals to reduce their own sentences. And Isabella, she'd been arrested too. Turned out she'd been helping Dominic launder money through her father's import business. The FBI had surveillance footage, wire transfers, everything they needed. She was facing 15 years. The trial was held at the federal courthouse in Manhattan, a massive building with marble columns and the weight of justice, real justice, in every corner. Tasha walked into that courtroom wearing a simple black dress, her scarred arm visible for everyone to see, her daughter with her mother back in the witness waiting room. Dominic was already there, sitting at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit that looked almost obscene on a man who'd once worn $1,000 suits. He looked diminished, smaller somehow, without his power, without his family's protection, without his ability to control and manipulate and hurt. When his eyes met Tasha's across the courtroom, she saw something she'd never seen before. Fear. He was afraid of her, of what she knew, of what she could say, of the power she held now that all of his was gone. The prosecutor, Michael Chen himself, stood up and addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice clear and strong, "this case is about many things. It's about organized crime. It's about corruption. It's about a man who believed he was above the law, who thought his money and his family's reputation would protect him from consequences. But most importantly, this case is about courage. The courage of one woman who refused to stay silent, who refused to accept abuse, who gathered evidence at tremendous personal risk and brought down an entire criminal organization. That woman is Tasha Russo, and you're about to hear her testimony." Tasha took the stand, her hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And then she told it. All of it. She told them about the courtship, about the red flags she'd ignored, about the isolation and control. She told them about the affair, about Isabella, about the escalating abuse. And then, with her voice steady and her eyes locked on the jury, she told them about the night Dominic had poured boiling water on her 7 months pregnant body. "He looked me in the eyes," she said, and the courtroom was so silent you could hear people breathing. And he said, "Let this be a reminder of what happens when you try to defy me." Then he left me on the floor, burned and pregnant and terrified. That's when I knew, if I didn't fight back, if I didn't find a way to escape, he would eventually kill me. The jury was transfixed. Several women were crying. Even the judge looked affected, his expression grim. Dominic's defense attorney tried to discredit her, tried to paint her as a scorned wife seeking revenge, but Tasha had evidence. So much evidence. The photographs, the recordings, the testimony from doctors who'd treated her burn, the financial documents showing Dominic's illegal activities. It was overwhelming, damning, irrefutable. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts: racketeering, money laundering, assault, witness intimidation. The list went on, and with each guilty, the foreman read. Tasha felt a piece of her soul returning, felt the weight of fear and shame and trauma lifting just a little bit. The judge sentenced Dominic Russo to 35 years in federal prison. 35 years. He'd be 72 years old when he got out, if he got out. Prison wasn't kind to former mob bosses. Everyone knew that. As they led him away in shackles, Dominic turned one last time to look at Tasha, and she saw it in his eyes, the realization, the understanding that she'd beaten him, that the woman he'd tried to destroy had instead destroyed him, that he'd underestimated her, had thought she was weak when she was actually the strongest person in that courtroom. "I underestimated you," he said quietly, the guards pausing for just a moment. "Yes," Tasha replied, her voice clear and strong. "You did. And that was your biggest mistake." Epilogue. 2 years after the trial, Tasha stood backstage at a women's empowerment conference in Manhattan, her hands shaking slightly, her heart pounding with nerves she hadn't felt since testifying in court. She'd been invited to speak, to tell her story to hundreds of women who were survivors themselves, or who were still trying to figure out how to escape their own dangerous situations. Her daughter, Hope, was with a babysitter back in their apartment, a beautiful 2-bedroom place in Harlem that Tasha had bought with money from the divorce settlement. Because yes, she divorced Dominic, took him for half of everything that hadn't been seized by the FBI. It wasn't about the money, though. She'd be lying if she said financial independence didn't feel good after years of being controlled. It was about closing that chapter of her life completely, legally, permanently. She'd started her own business, a consulting firm that helped women entrepreneurs build their brands and businesses. She'd hired her cousin Monica as her partner. They were successful, growing, making a difference, and Tasha was happy. Genuinely, authentically happy for the first time since before she'd met Dominic Russo. "You ready?" Monica asked, squeezing her hand backstage. "As I'll ever be," Tasha said. She walked onto that stage, and the applause was overwhelming. Hundreds of women, all standing, all cheering for her. And Tasha felt tears prick at her eyes because this moment right here was the real victory. Not the trial, not the sentence. This, being able to stand in front of other women and say, "I survived. You can too." "My name is Tasha Williams," she began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "And 2 years ago, I was trapped in the worst situation of my life. I was married to a man who hurt me, who tried to break my spirit, who thought I would stay silent forever. But I didn't stay silent. I fought back, and I won." She told them her story, not all of it. Some things were still too private, too painful, but enough. Enough for them to understand the journey. Enough for them to see that survival was possible, that justice was possible, that rebuilding was possible. "Revenge," she said near the end of her speech, "isn't about becoming as cruel as the people who hurt you. Real revenge is about taking back your power. It's about building something beautiful from the ashes. It's about looking at the person who tried to destroy you and showing them that they failed, that you're still here, still strong, still fighting, still winning." The applause when she finished was deafening. Women on their feet, some crying, some cheering, and Tasha stood there feeling that power radiating through her entire body. She'd survived. She'd fought. She'd won. Meanwhile, in a federal prison 2 hours upstate, Dominic Russo sat in his cell watching the news. There was a segment about a women's empowerment conference, and they showed clips of speeches, including Tasha's. He watched his ex-wife on that screen, watched her talk about survival and strength and building a better life. He saw how beautiful she looked, how confident, how successful. He saw everything he'd lost. His empire was gone. His reputation was destroyed. His family had disowned him. Even his Uncle Vincent from his own prison cell had sent word that Dominic was no longer part of the family, was a disgrace who'd brought shame on the Russo name. Isabella was serving her own sentence, had testified against him to reduce her time, had abandoned him the moment it was convenient. He was alone, broken, miserable, and watching Tasha on that screen, watching her thrive while he rotted in a cell, Dominic finally understood something. He'd lost from the moment he'd hurt her. Because Tasha Williams wasn't the weak, controllable woman he'd thought she was. She was a survivor, a fighter, someone who turned her trauma into power and her pain into purpose. He'd underestimated her, and it had cost him everything. Tasha walked out of that conference center into the Manhattan sunshine, her phone buzzing with a text from her babysitter saying Hope was awake and asking for her mommy. "I'm on my way," Tasha texted back, smiling. She got into her car, a sensible sedan she'd bought herself, not some status symbol, and drove through the city that was hers now, past the buildings and streets where she'd once felt trapped, toward the home she'd built for herself and her daughter. And as she drove, she thought about everything that had happened, all the pain, all the fear, all the moments she'd wanted to give up but didn't. And she thought about what came next, the business she'd continue to grow, the women she'd help, the daughter she'd raised to be strong and independent and unbreakable, the life she was creating on her own terms. Tasha Williams had been broken, had been burned, had been pushed to the absolute edge of what a human being could endure. But she'd survived. More than that, she'd triumphed. She pulled into her driveway, saw her babysitter holding Hope in the doorway, that beautiful baby girl waving her tiny hands and smiling, and Tasha realized something profound. This was victory. Not the angry, destructive kind, but the sweet, powerful kind that comes from reclaiming your life and making it better than it ever was before. She got out of the car, took her daughter in her arms, and walked into her home, her sanctuary, her future, and the door closed behind her, shutting out the past and all its pain, opening up a future full of possibility and hope and the kind of happiness that can only come from knowing you survived the worst and came out stronger. Tasha Williams won, not just because she destroyed Dominic Russo, though she did, but because she saved herself. And in doing so, she became the woman she was always meant to be, strong, resilient, unbreakable, and free. Did this story touch your heart? Did Tasha's strength inspire you? I hope it did, because stories like this need to be told. Women like Tasha need to be celebrated. If you enjoyed this journey, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We have so many more powerful stories coming your way. Stories of survival, of triumph, of women who refuse to stay broken. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Comment below and tell me what you thought. Where are you watching from? What did you learn from Tasha's story? I want to hear from you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening, and remember, you are never powerless. Even in your darkest moment, you have strength inside you. Use it. Fight back. Survive. Win. I'll see you in the next story.